Welcome, weary soul, to this quiet space of biblical history. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection, I'm grateful you've chosen to join me on this journey back through time. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always wonderful to see our community of history enthusiasts gathered here from across the globe. Tonight, we're traveling far back to a land where the sun beats down mercilessly on dusty hills, where survival was a daily battle against both nature and neighboring peoples. We're journeying to ancient Israel, a place that would become the crossroads of civilizations, the birthplace of three great religions, and home to some of humanity's most enduring stories. But beneath the familiar tales we know so well lies a harsher reality. A world where life was often brutal, unforgiving, and desperately uncertain. The rolling hills of ancient Palestine around 1000 BCE. The landscape stretches before you like a patchwork quilt of olive groves and rocky terraces, where every precious drop of water must be carefully preserved, and every harvest could mean the difference between life and death. This is not the romanticized holy land of Sunday school illustrations, but a harsh and demanding environment where ordinary people struggle daily just to survive. The morning sun rises over a small village nestled in the Judean hills. Smoke begins to curl from cooking fires as families wake to face another day of backbreaking labor. There are no alarm clocks here, no electric lights to push back the darkness. Life moves to the rhythm of the sun and seasons, and every moment of daylight is precious. In a modest stone house with walls of rough-hewn limestone, a farmer named Joab stirs from his straw mattress. The floor beneath him is packed earth, and the air carries the scent of animals from the courtyard below, where his few sheep and goats huddle together for warmth. His wife Sarah is already awake, grinding barley on a stone quern that her grandmother used before her. The rhythmic scraping sound echoes through their simple home, a sound that has marked the beginning of countless mornings in countless homes across this ancient land. Outside, the village is coming to life with the quiet urgency that characterizes existence in ancient Israel. Children emerge from doorways, their faces already marked by the harsh realities of their world. Many bear the scars of childhood diseases that claimed their siblings, for in this time before modern medicine, only the strongest survived to adulthood. A mother might bear 8 children and consider herself blessed if half live to see their 10th year. Joab steps into his courtyard and examines his small flock with the practiced eye of a man whose survival depends on these animals. Each goat, each sheep represents wealth, security, and hope for the future. Their milk provides sustenance for his family. Their wool can be woven into clothing, and in times of desperate need, their meat might keep starvation at bay. But they are also vulnerable to disease, to wild animals that prowl the hills at night, and to raiders who might sweep down from the desert without warning. The threat of violence hangs over everything in ancient Israel like a perpetual storm cloud. This is a land caught between great empires, Egypt to the south, Assyria and Babylon to the north and east. It sits along the great trade routes that connect Africa to Asia, making it both prosperous and perpetually contested. Armies march through these hills with disturbing regularity, leaving devastation in their wake. But it's not just the great powers that pose a threat. The Philistines control the coastal plain with their iron weapons and military organization that makes them formidable opponents for the bronze-armed Israelites. To the east, across the Jordan River, the Ammonites and Moabites launch frequent raids, stealing livestock and grain, burning villages, and carrying off captives to be sold in distant slave markets. Even within Israel itself, life is dangerous. The central government, if it exists at all, is weak and distant. Justice often comes at the point of a sword, and blood feuds between families and clans can span generations. A man might wake one morning to find his fields burned, his animals stolen, and his family scattered, or worse. All because his grandfather had wronged someone from a neighbouring village decades earlier. Sarah grinds her barley with steady, practiced motions, but her ears are always listening for sounds that don't belong. The distant thunder of hoofbeats, the war cries of raiders, the screams that would signal the approach of death. This is the reality for women in ancient Israel, a life lived on the edge of catastrophe, where the protection of male relatives is often the only thing standing between them and a fate too terrible to contemplate. The barley Sarah grinds will become the day's bread, if they're fortunate enough to have barley. In lean times, bread might be made from beans, lentils, or even acorns, ground into a coarse, bitter flour that fills the stomach but provides little nourishment. Famine stalks this land with persistent cruelty. When the rains fail, as they do with heartbreaking regularity, crops wither in the fields and families face impossible choices. Children become hollow-eyed and listless, their small bodies consuming themselves to stay alive. Parents watch helplessly as their little ones grow thinner each day, knowing that the next harvest is months away and their stores are already nearly exhausted. Some families abandon their ancestral lands and join the desperate streams of refugees seeking mercy in more fortunate regions. Others stay and simply pray for death to come quickly when the end arrives. Disease, too, is a constant companion in ancient Israel. Without understanding of germs or hygiene, plagues can sweep through communities like wildfire. A simple cut can become infected and claim a strong man's life within days. Childbirth is a dangerous ordeal for both mother and child, with many women dying in labour and countless infants never drawing their first breath. The water sources that communities depend on can become contaminated without warning, leading to outbreaks of dysentery that can kill dozens before running their course. Skin diseases, eye infections, and parasitic infestations are so common that a person free from such ailments is considered blessed by God himself. Yet for all these hardships, the people of ancient Israel possess a resilience that borders on miraculous. They have developed strategies for survival that have been passed down through generations of struggle. They know which wild plants can supplement a meagre diet, how to preserve meat and vegetables for the lean months, and how to read the subtle signs that might warn of approaching danger. Their social structures, too, have evolved to help them survive. Extended families cluster together in small villages, sharing resources and providing mutual protection. When raiders threaten, every able-bodied person becomes a defender. When famine strikes, those with surplus share with those in need, knowing that their own survival might depend on such generosity when their turn for hardship comes. The village elder, a weathered man named Abner, whose beard has grown white through decades of surviving in this harsh land, calls the men together as the sun reaches its zenith. His voice carries the authority of one who has seen crops fail and harvests flourish, who has hidden in caves while armies passed and celebrated when enemies were defeated. Today, he brings troubling news. Scouts have reported armed men moving through the hills to the north, and the village must prepare for the possibility of attack. The preparations that follow are swift and well practiced. Women and children gather the most precious possessions, grain stores, valuable tools, family treasures, and prepare to flee to hidden caves in the surrounding hills if necessary. Men check their weapons, bronze-tipped spears, slings, the occasional iron sword that represents a family's most prized possession. These are not professional soldiers, but farmers and herders who must transform themselves into warriors at a moment's notice to protect everything they hold dear. As evening approaches and the threat passes without incident, the village settles into the uneasy peace that passes for normalcy in ancient Israel. Families gather around small fires, sharing their simple evening meal and telling the stories that bind them together. Tales of ancestors who survived even greater hardships, of divine interventions that saved their people from destruction, of promises that sustain hope even in the darkest times. Young children listen wide-eyed to stories of great kings and mighty prophets, of plagues and miracles, of a God who watches over his chosen people, even when life seems unbearably harsh. These stories are more than entertainment. They are the foundation of identity, the source of strength that allows a people to endure generation after generation of struggle and suffering. The stars emerge one by one in the clear desert sky, the same stars that have watched over this land since the beginning of time. In their ancient light, the harsh realities of daily life seem to soften just slightly. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new threats, new struggles for survival. But tonight, families are safe, children are fed, and the ancient rhythms of life continue as they have for countless generations before. This is the world of ancient Israel, brutal, unforgiving, yet somehow beautiful in its stark simplicity. It is a world where every sunrise is a gift, every harvest a miracle, and every peaceful night a blessing to be treasured. As we settle into our own comfortable beds, perhaps we can find a moment to marvel at the strength of those who came before us, who carved out lives of meaning and purpose in one of history's most challenging times and places. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the hills of Judah, its heat already promising another day of relentless struggle for the scattered families who called this unforgiving land home. As the first light crept across the barren landscape, the women of the village were already stirring, their calloused hands reaching for clay water jars that would need to be carried to the nearest well, often a journey of several miles across rocky terrain that could tear flesh from bare feet and leave the strongest among them gasping for breath in the thin mountain air. Water, that most precious of all commodities, was never something that could be taken for granted in ancient Israel. Unlike the great river civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, where the Nile and Euphrates provided reliable sources of life-giving water, the children of Abraham found themselves dependent on the fickle rains that might come in season or might not come at all. The winter rains, arriving between October and April, were the difference between abundance and starvation, between life and death for entire communities. When the rains failed, as they did with devastating regularity, wells ran dry and cisterns cracked under the relentless sun. Families would gather whatever possessions they could carry and begin the desperate migration toward any rumor of water, joining long caravans of the desperate and dying as they searched for relief that might never come. The lucky ones might find employment in the households of the wealthy, trading their freedom for the promise of a daily ration of barley and a cup of tepid water. But even in the good years, when the rains came and the cisterns filled, water remained a source of constant anxiety and conflict. Villages fought bitter wars over access to springs and wells, and the theft of water was considered among the most heinous of crimes, often punishable by death or exile. Women would rise before dawn to make the treacherous journey to distant water sources, carrying heavy pottery vessels on their heads while navigating steep mountain paths, where a single misstep could mean a broken neck and death for both mother and the children who depended on her. The daily ritual of water collection was fraught with danger beyond the physical. Bandits knew that women traveling to wells were vulnerable targets, often carrying what little valuables a family possessed to trade for water rights. Many a mother never returned from her morning journey, her body found days later by searching parties, stripped of everything valuable and left to rot under the pitiless sun. Yet even when water could be found, it was rarely clean or safe to drink. Stagnant pools harbored diseases that could sweep through a family in a matter of days, causing bloody flux and fever that left the strongest men writhing in agony. Children were particularly vulnerable to waterborne illnesses, and it was not uncommon for parents to lose half their offspring before they reached their 5th year. Their small bodies unable to fight off the constant assault of parasites and bacteria that lurked in every drop. The storage of water presented its own challenges and horrors. Clay cisterns, carved deep into the bedrock, were constantly contaminated by dead animals, human waste, and the decomposing bodies of insects and rodents that fell through the narrow openings. The water that families drank was often thick with sediment and alive with microscopic creatures that could be seen swimming in the murky liquid when held up to the light. During times of siege, when enemy armies surrounded the cities and cut off access to external water sources, the situation became truly desperate. The wealthy might have private cisterns that could sustain them for weeks or even months, but the poor were forced to drink from communal pools that quickly became cesspools of human waste and disease. Chronicles from these periods describe water so foul that it had to be strained through cloth multiple times before it could be consumed, and even then it often caused violent sickness. The psychological toll of constant water insecurity cannot be overstated. Mothers would lie awake at night, listening to their children cry from thirst, knowing that the family's water ration was already exhausted, and that tomorrow would bring another agonizing choice between giving the children what little remained and saving it for the journey to find more. Fathers would spend their days scanning the horizon for signs of rain clouds that might never come, watching their crops wither and their livestock die while feeling utterly powerless to provide for their families. The religious significance of water in ancient Israelite culture reflected this daily struggle for survival. The ritual washing prescribed by Mosaic law was often impossible to fulfill properly, as families simply could not spare the water needed for ceremonial cleansing. This created a constant tension between religious obligation and physical survival, forcing people to choose between spiritual purity and staying alive. Wells and springs became not just sources of physical sustenance, but sacred sites, where communities would gather to pray for rain and offer sacrifices to ensure continued access to water. The ownership and control of these vital resources was often determined by complex tribal agreements and ancient claims that could spark conflicts lasting for generations. The technology available for water management was primitive and often ineffective. While the wealthy might afford to dig deep wells or construct elaborate cistern systems, most families relied on simple pottery vessels and crude collection methods that were inadequate for storing enough water to survive extended dry periods. The constant breakage and loss of these precious containers added another layer of anxiety to daily life. Trade and commerce were severely hampered by water scarcity, as merchants had to factor the availability of water into every journey. Caravans would sometimes arrive at trading posts to find that wells had run dry, forcing them to abandon valuable goods and flee into the desert with whatever water they could carry. The economic impact of this uncertainty rippled through every aspect of society, from the price of grain to the value of livestock. The seasonal nature of water availability created boom and bust cycles that define the rhythm of life in ancient Israel. During the rainy season, when water was relatively abundant, families would work frantically to repair and expand their storage capacity, knowing that the next dry period could last for months or even years. Children learned from an early age to treat every drop as precious, and the waste of water was considered not just foolish, but morally reprehensible. Women, who bore the primary responsibility for water collection and management, developed an intricate knowledge of weather patterns, seasonal variations, and the location of hidden springs that could mean the difference between life and death for their families. This knowledge was passed down through generations of mothers to daughters, creating an oral tradition of survival that was as valuable as any written law. The impact on children was particularly devastating. Young bodies, already weakened by poor nutrition and constant exposure to disease, were often unable to survive the dehydration that came with water shortages. Parents would make the agonizing decision to give their water rations to the strongest children, hoping that at least some of their offspring would survive to carry on the family line. The elderly and infirm were often the first casualties when water became scarce. Unable to make the long journeys to distant wells and unable to compete with younger, stronger community members for access to limited supplies, they would simply waste away, their bodies shutting down as dehydration took its inexorable toll. Even in death, water remained a concern. The ritual washing of bodies before burial was often impossible during dry periods, forcing families to choose between proper religious observance and conserving water for the living. This created additional spiritual anguish for people who believed that improper burial rites could affect the soul's journey in the afterlife. The construction and maintenance of water infrastructure required enormous communal effort and resources that most villages simply could not afford. The digging of a single well might require months of backbreaking labor by dozens of men, and there was no guarantee that they would find water at the end of their efforts. Many villages were dotted with the remnants of failed wells, monuments to desperate hope and crushing disappointment. The storage and distribution of water within communities was a source of constant conflict and social tension. Those with access to private wells or cisterns held enormous power over their neighbors, and water rights were jealously guarded and fiercely defended. The wealthy could afford to purchase water during shortages, while the poor were forced to trade their labor, their possessions, or even their children for access to this most basic necessity of life. As we drift deeper into the realm of sleep, we can almost feel the weight of those ancient water jars on our shoulders, the burn of the desert sun on our faces, and the constant gnawing anxiety that came with never knowing when the next drink might come. The people of ancient Israel lived every day with the knowledge that their survival hung by the slenderest of threads, dependent on the mercy of the elements and the jealously guarded resources of their neighbors. In our modern world, where clean water flows endlessly from our taps and we rarely give a second thought to this miraculous abundance, it's difficult to truly comprehend the daily terror and desperation that defined life in a land where every drop was precious beyond measure. Yet as we close our eyes and let these ancient struggles fade into the gentle embrace of dreams, we can perhaps gain a deeper appreciation for the simple miracle of turning a handle and watching clear, clean water flow freely into our waiting hands. The story of water in ancient Israel is ultimately a story of human resilience in the face of impossible odds, of communities that somehow found ways to survive and even thrive despite the constant threat of thirst and death. It reminds us that the most basic elements of life, the things we take most for granted, were once precious beyond imagining, fought over and died for in a land where the difference between abundance and extinction could be measured in a few precious drops of life-giving water. The grinding of grain echoed through the pre-dawn darkness as another day began in ancient Israel. For most families, this sound marked not just the start of morning routines, but the endless cycle of survival that defined their existence. The woman bent over the stone quern had likely been awake since before the first light touched the horizon, knowing that the bread she ground today might be the difference between her children sleeping peacefully or crying from hunger. Life in ancient Israel was measured not in years or seasons, but in the constant struggle between abundance and scarcity, between the blessing of rain and the curse of drought. Every aspect of daily existence carried the weight of uncertainty, where a single failed harvest could spell disaster for entire communities. The typical Israelite home was a modest affair, usually consisting of 2 or 3 rooms built around a central courtyard. The ground floor served multiple purposes: storage for precious grain, shelter for the family's few animals, and workspace for daily tasks. The family lived primarily on the upper level, accessible by a ladder or simple stone steps. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Multiple generations crowded together in spaces that would seem impossibly small by today's standards. During the day, the house buzzed with activity. Women ground grain, spun wool, and tended to children while managing the endless task of food preparation. Every meal required hours of work. Grain had to be ground by hand, bread baked in clay ovens, and water carried from distant wells or springs. There were no corner stores, no quick solutions to hunger. If the family ran out of grain, they went hungry until the next opportunity to trade or work for more. The men faced their own brutal realities. Those fortunate enough to own land spent their days battling the elements, coaxing crops from soil that could be generous one year and merciless the next. The hot, dry summers scorched the earth, while the brief, rainy seasons often brought too much water too quickly, washing away precious topsoil. Farmers learned to read the sky with the intensity of life and death, because their survival depended on understanding when to plant, when to harvest, and when to pray for rain. For those without land, and there were many, life meant constant uncertainty. They survived as day labourers, working other people's fields for meagre wages that might consist of grain, oil, or a few pieces of silver. Some days brought work, others brought empty hands and empty stomachs. The unemployed gathered each morning at the village gates, hoping a landowner might need extra hands for planting or harvest. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that even the employed faced months of relative idleness. During these periods, men might take up crafts, metalworking, pottery, or carpentry, but competition was fierce and skills were closely guarded. Family secrets passed down through generations. A father's greatest gift to his son was not land or money, but knowledge of a trade that could sustain him through lean times. Children in ancient Israel learned early that survival required contribution. By age 5 or 6, they were already helping with simple tasks, carrying water, gathering fuel for fires, watching younger siblings. Education was primarily practical. Boys learned their father's trade, while girls mastered the complex skills of household management. The idea of childhood as a protected time of play and learning was simply incompatible with the harsh realities of daily survival. The spectre of famine haunted every family's calculations. When crops failed, whether from drought, locusts, disease, or war, the social order began to unravel. Families sold possessions first, then their land, and finally themselves into slavery to survive. The Bible records numerous famines that devastated the region, forcing mass migrations and reshaping entire communities. During these desperate times, the normal social boundaries dissolved. Wealthy families found themselves reduced to begging, while those who had stored grain wisely suddenly held the power of life and death over their neighbours. The familiar became strange as people resorted to eating grass, bark, and anything else that might provide sustenance. Water, always precious in this arid land, became a source of constant anxiety. Most families depended on cisterns, underground chambers carved from rock to collect and store rainwater. These cisterns required careful maintenance and could easily become contaminated. A cracked cistern meant disaster, forcing families to depend on often distant springs or wells that might be controlled by others. The quality of water was always questionable. Disease spread easily through contaminated water sources, and families learned to boil water when fuel allowed, or to add wine or vinegar in hopes of killing harmful elements. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses regularly swept through communities, claiming lives and weakening survivors. Trade provided some relief from local shortages, but it also brought new forms of vulnerability. Merchant caravans crossing the land bridges between Africa, Asia, and Europe made some Israelites wealthy, but they also brought foreign armies, new diseases, and economic instability. When trade routes shifted or became dangerous, entire communities that had depended on commerce found themselves cut off from the wider world. The constant threat of violence shadowed every aspect of life. Local conflicts erupted regularly over water rights, grazing lands, or trade disputes. Bandits preyed on travelers and isolated settlements. Foreign armies swept through the land with devastating regularity, destroying crops, killing livestock, and carrying off people as slaves. Women faced particular vulnerabilities. In times of conflict, they often bore the worst consequences, captured, enslaved, or left to fend for themselves and their children when men were killed or taken. The biblical narratives are filled with stories of women struggling to survive in a world that offered them little protection and few options for independent survival. Even in peacetime, the legal system provided only limited security. Justice often depended on having enough wealth or influence to make one's case heard. The poor found themselves at the mercy of those with power, unable to seek redress for wrongs or protection from exploitation. Yet perhaps the most brutal aspect of life in ancient Israel was the psychological weight of uncertainty. Modern life, for all its stresses, provides numerous safety nets and backup plans. Ancient Israelites lived with the knowledge that everything they had could disappear overnight through natural disaster, war, disease, or economic collapse. This uncertainty shaped their worldview, their relationships, and their understanding of divine providence. They developed a fierce appreciation for community solidarity, understanding that survival often depended on mutual aid. Extended families formed protective networks, sharing resources during hard times and celebrating together during periods of abundance. Religious festivals provided not just spiritual meaning, but practical opportunities to share food, renew social bonds, and organize community responses to challenges. The rhythm of religious observance provided structure and hope in an otherwise unpredictable existence. The weekly Sabbath offered a brief respite from the endless cycle of labor. Religious festivals marked the seasons and provided occasions for community gathering. The temple system, when functioning, offered a sense of divine protection and national identity that helped people endure personal hardships. As we drift towards sleep, we might imagine ourselves walking through an ancient Israelite village in the quiet hours before dawn. The air carries the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cries while a mother softly sings a lullaby. These sounds of life continuing despite hardship remind us of the resilience that characterized these ancient people. Their story is ultimately one of survival against overwhelming odds, of communities that endured through mutual support and stubborn hope. In their struggles, we see reflected our own capacity for endurance, our own need for community, and our own search for meaning in the face of uncertainty. Sleep well, knowing that the human spirit that sustained our ancestors through those harsh times continues to sustain us today. Beyond the constant threat of violence and the relentless struggle for water and food, the people of ancient Israel faced another formidable adversary that could strike without warning, devastating entire communities in a matter of days. Disease, that invisible enemy, stalked the dusty paths between villages and crept through the cramped quarters where families huddled together for warmth and protection. Picture, if you will, a typical dwelling in ancient Israel. The modest stone structure, perhaps 20 feet square, housed not just a family of 6 or 7, but often their precious livestock as well. The animals, brought inside during the cold desert nights, provided warmth through their body heat, but they also brought something else. The close quarters, with humans and beasts sharing the same air, the same water sources, and often the same sleeping spaces, created perfect conditions for the spread of illness. The smell would have been overwhelming by our standards. The acrid smoke from dung fires mixed with the musk of goats and sheep, the sour odour of fermented grain, and the ever-present dust that seemed to coat everything. But for the inhabitants of these humble homes, this was simply life. They had no choice but to breathe this air, to drink from wells that might be contaminated by runoff, to eat food that had been stored in conditions we would consider unsafe. When sickness struck, it often moved through these close-knit communities like wildfire. A merchant arriving from Damascus might carry more than just goods in his pack. A child playing by the village well could unknowingly become the first link in a chain of transmission that would claim dozens of lives before running its course. The ancient world had no understanding of germs, no concept of quarantine, no medicines that could halt the spread of infectious disease. Consider the plight of Rachel, a young mother in a hill country village. Her infant son had been feverish for 2 days, his small body burning with a heat that no cool cloth could ease. She had tried everything her mother had taught her: herbs gathered from the rocky slopes, prayers whispered in the pre-dawn darkness, even a costly visit from the village wise woman who claimed to know the healing arts. But the fever would not break. By the 3rd day, Rachel's husband, Micah, was showing the same symptoms: the telltale flush across his cheeks, the glassy look in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he tried to continue his work in the barley fields. Within a week, 3 more families in their small settlement were affected. The children suffered most, their small bodies unable to fight off what might have been typhoid, dysentery, or any number of bacterial infections that flourished in the unsanitary conditions of the time. The absence of proper sanitation compounded every health crisis. Human waste was often disposed of in the most convenient location, which might be dangerously close to water sources. The same stream that provided drinking water for a village might also serve as a dumping ground for refuse, creating a cycle of contamination that ensured disease would find fertile ground. Food preservation presented constant challenges and dangers. Without refrigeration, meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. But these methods were not foolproof, especially during the scorching summer months when temperatures could soar above 100 degrees. Grain, the staple of most diets, was stored in large clay jars, but these containers could crack, allowing moisture to enter and fungi to flourish. Eating moldy grain could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Even the water, that most precious of resources, carried its own hidden perils. Wells, those vital lifelines in the arid landscape, could become contaminated by animal carcasses, human waste, or simply by stagnant conditions that allowed harmful bacteria to multiply. During the dry season, when water levels dropped, the concentration of contaminants increased, making every drink a potential threat. The people of ancient Israel developed various strategies to cope with these health challenges, though their understanding of the underlying causes was limited. They learned to recognize certain warning signs, the way a person's skin might take on a yellowish tint, indicating liver problems, or how swollen joints might signal the onset of a debilitating condition. They developed a pharmacopoeia of sorts, using plants and minerals they believed had healing properties. Frankincense, that precious resin we associate with the wise men's gifts, was valued not just for its fragrant smoke, but for its supposed medicinal qualities. It was ground into powder and mixed with oil to create salves for wounds, or burned to purify the air in sick rooms. Myrrh, another costly import, was used to treat everything from digestive ailments to skin conditions. But for all their experimentation with natural remedies, the people of ancient Israel were fighting battles they could not hope to win with the knowledge and tools at their disposal. Religious beliefs often intersected with medical understanding in ways that both helped and hindered healing. Some ailments were viewed as punishment for sin, leading to social isolation that might actually help prevent the spread of contagious diseases. albeit for the wrong reasons. The complex purity laws found in Leviticus, while primarily spiritual in nature, sometimes had the unintended consequence of promoting better hygiene practices. Yet when epidemic disease struck, these same religious frameworks could prove inadequate. A community might fast and pray while a plague ravaged their children, attributing the disaster to divine wrath rather than understanding the environmental factors that contributed to the outbreak. The tension between faith and helplessness in the face of inexplicable suffering created its own form of anguish for people who believed deeply in a God who controlled every aspect of their existence. The psychological toll of living under the constant threat of disease cannot be overstated. Every cough, every fever, every unusual rash carried the potential for catastrophe. Parents watched their children with anxious eyes, looking for any sign that the shadow of illness was approaching their household. The loss of a child to disease was heartbreakingly common, yet no less devastating for its frequency. Imagine the weight of responsibility felt by a village elder when faced with an outbreak of some unknown malady. Should the community isolate the affected families, potentially condemning them to death from starvation? Should they continue normal activities and risk the spread of whatever plague had taken hold? These decisions, made without any real understanding of disease transmission, often determined who lived and who died. The seasonal patterns of illness added another layer of dread to the already challenging cycle of agricultural life. Summer brought the risk of food poisoning and waterborne diseases as the heat accelerated spoilage and concentrated contaminants. Winter's cold and damp conditions fostered respiratory ailments that could quickly become pneumonia. Spring floods might contaminate wells and fields, while autumn's harvest season brought people together in ways that facilitated the spread of contagious diseases. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the people of ancient Israel developed a remarkable resilience in the face of health crises. Communities would rally around affected families, sharing food and water, even when resources were scarce. Traditional healing knowledge was carefully preserved and passed down through generations, creating a network of folk wisdom that, while not always scientifically sound, provided comfort and sometimes genuine relief. The strong, extended family structures that characterized ancient Israelite society served as a crucial support system during health emergencies. When a breadwinner fell ill, relatives would step in to maintain fields and tend livestock. When mothers were too sick to care for their children, grandmothers and aunts would take over these vital responsibilities. This interconnectedness, born of necessity in a harsh and unforgiving environment, helped communities survive challenges that might otherwise have proved fatal. As we consider the daily reality of disease and death that shadowed every aspect of life in ancient Israel, we begin to understand how these experiences shaped not just individual character, but entire cultural worldviews. The acceptance of suffering as an inevitable part of human existence, the deep appreciation for health when it was present, the fierce loyalty to family and community, all of these values were forged in the crucible of constant vulnerability to forces beyond human control. The people who walked these ancient paths, who drew water from these wells, who slept in these humble dwellings, were not so different from us in their basic human needs and desires. They wanted to protect their families, to see their children grow and prosper, to live lives of meaning and purpose. But they pursued these universal goals while facing challenges that would test the limits of human endurance, challenges that remind us how precious and fragile the gift of health truly is. The shadows had grown long across the ancient landscape of Israel, and as we reach the final chapter of our journey through this harsh and unforgiving world, we must confront perhaps the most sobering truth of all, that for the people of ancient Israel, survival itself was both a daily miracle and a constant burden that shaped not just their bodies, but their very souls. Throughout our exploration, We have witnessed the relentless brutality that defined existence in this biblical land. We have walked alongside farmers whose backs bent under the scorching sun, whose hands bled from thorns and stones as they coaxed reluctant harvests from soil that seemed determined to resist their efforts. We have sat with mothers who counted each grain of barley like precious gems, knowing that a single miscalculation could mean watching their children waste away before their eyes. We have felt the desperation of families huddled in their modest dwellings as another season of drought stretched endlessly before them, the cisterns running dry and hope itself becoming as scarce as the rains that refuse to fall. But perhaps most striking of all has been the recognition that this suffering was not merely physical. The constant threat of famine, disease, and violence created a psychological landscape as harsh as the physical terrain. The people of ancient Israel lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing whether the next harvest would sustain them, whether the next illness would claim a loved one, or whether raiders from neighboring territories would sweep down to destroy everything they had worked so desperately to build. This anxiety manifested itself in countless ways throughout their daily lives. Mothers would wake in the dark hours before dawn, not from the crow of roosters or the stirring of household activity, but from the gnawing worry that had become their constant companion. They would lie still in the darkness, listening to the breathing of their children, counting each breath as a small victory against the forces that seemed arrayed against their family's survival. Fathers would check and recheck their meager stores of grain, calculating and recalculating how long the supplies might last, always knowing that their estimates were optimistic at best. The children, too, bore the weight of this harsh existence. Unlike the carefree youth we might imagine in more prosperous times, the children of ancient Israel were thrust into adult responsibilities almost from the moment they could walk. Young boys learned to read the sky for signs of rain with the intensity of scholars studying sacred texts, while girls mastered the complex art of water conservation with a precision that would determine their family's fate. Play, when it existed at all, often mimicked the serious business of survival. Children would practice tending imaginary flocks or grinding pretend grain, unconsciously preparing themselves for the brutal realities that awaited them in adulthood. The social fabric of these communities was stretched thin by the constant pressure of survival. While we have seen how neighbors often came together in times of crisis, sharing resources and supporting one another through the darkest periods, we must also acknowledge that desperation could turn friend against friend, brother against brother. When a family's survival hung in the balance, the bonds of community could strain to the breaking point. Stories passed down through generations told of bitter disputes over water rights, of families torn apart by accusations of theft when grain stores went missing, of marriages destroyed by the impossible choices that poverty forced upon loving couples. The religious life of ancient Israel was deeply intertwined with these harsh realities. Faith was not an abstract concept discussed in comfortable sanctuaries, but a desperate, visceral need that emerged from the daily struggle to stay alive. When the people cried out to their God, their voices carried the raw desperation of those who had nowhere else to turn. Their prayers were not polite requests, but urgent pleas born from empty stomachs and dying livestock and children burning with fever in the night. The festivals and observances that marked their religious calendar were often as much about survival as worship. The harvest festivals celebrating not just divine provision, but the simple fact that they had managed to gather enough food to see them through another winter. This intimate connection between survival and spirituality created a unique worldview that shaped every aspect of their existence. The people of ancient Israel understood in ways that we in our modern comfort can barely comprehend, that life itself was a gift that could be withdrawn at any moment. They lived with an acute awareness of their own mortality and the fragility of everything they held dear. This awareness bred both a deep appreciation for life's simple pleasures and a resignation to suffering that might seem foreign to our contemporary sensibilities. Yet within this harsh existence, we also find remarkable examples of human resilience and adaptability. The women who developed ingenious methods for preserving food through the lean months, the farmers who learned to read the subtlest signs in soil and sky, the craftsmen who created tools and vessels that could withstand years of hard use. All of these represent triumph of human ingenuity over seemingly impossible circumstances. These people were not merely victims of their harsh environment, they were survivors who carved out lives of meaning and purpose despite the overwhelming challenges they faced. The family structures that evolved in ancient Israel were also shaped by these harsh realities. Extended families often lived in close proximity, not just for emotional support, but for practical survival. When disaster struck, and disaster was always lurking, having multiple generations and branches of a family nearby could mean the difference between life and death. Grandparents were valued not just for their wisdom, but for their accumulated knowledge of survival techniques. Children were precious not just as beloved offspring, but as future laborers whose strength would be essential for the family's continued existence. Marriage, too, took on dimensions that went far beyond romantic love. While affection certainly played a role in these unions, practical considerations often dominated. A young woman's ability to manage a household efficiently, to preserve food skillfully, and to bear healthy children was as important as any personal quality she might possess. Young men were evaluated not just on their character, but on their ability to provide for a family, to defend their household against threats, and to work the land productively. These were not cold, calculating arrangements, but practical adaptations to a world where survival required every possible advantage. The constant presence of death in ancient Israel created a culture that was simultaneously fatalistic and fiercely protective of life. Parents knew that many of their children would not survive to adulthood, and this knowledge colored every interaction with their offspring. They loved deeply but guardedly, celebrating each milestone while preparing themselves for the possibility of loss. The elderly were revered, partly because reaching old age was itself an achievement that spoke to both luck and skill in navigating life's countless dangers. Disease, as we have explored, was not just a medical concern, but a community crisis that could devastate entire settlements. The lack of understanding about the causes and transmission of illness meant that when sickness struck, it often spread unchecked through households and neighborhoods. The psychological impact of watching loved ones suffer and die from conditions that seemed to strike without warning or pattern created a constant undercurrent of fear that shaped daily decision-making and social interactions. The relationship between the people of ancient Israel and their physical environment was complex and often adversarial. The land that had been promised to them as the inheritance often seemed more like a harsh master than a generous provider. The rocky soil demanded backbreaking labor for minimal returns. The climate was unpredictable and often hostile. The wildlife included dangerous predators and disease-carrying pests. Yet this same harsh land also provided the stage for some of humanity's most profound spiritual insights and cultural achievements. The very difficulty of life in ancient Israel seemed to forge a people capable of remarkable resilience and deep spiritual understanding. As we consider the cumulative impact of all these hardships, the constant hunger, the ever-present threat of disease, the anxiety about water and weather, the danger from human enemies, the crushing physical labor, the loss of children and loved ones, we begin to understand why the concept of a promised land, a place of peace and plenty, held such powerful appeal for these people. The hope of eventual deliverance from their harsh circumstances was not an abstract theological concept, but a desperate psychological necessity that kept them functioning in the face of overwhelming adversity. The stories and traditions that emerged from this crucible of suffering carry within them the distilled wisdom of countless generations who learned to find meaning and purpose despite circumstances that might crush the human spirit. the Psalms that speak of walking through the valley of the shadow of death, the Proverbs that counsel patience and endurance, the prophetic visions of a time when swords would be beaten into plowshares. All of these emerged from the lived experience of people who knew intimately what it meant to struggle against overwhelming odds. In our final moments together on this journey through ancient Israel, we must acknowledge that while we have focused necessarily on the hardships and suffering that defined this existence, we should not lose sight of the remarkable human capacity for joy and celebration that persisted even in the darkest times. When the rains finally came after a long drought, when a child survived a dangerous illness, when a harvest exceeded expectations, when a wedding brought two families together in hope for the future. These moments of joy shone all the brighter against the backdrop of everyday hardship. The people of ancient Israel understood something that our modern world, with all its comforts and conveniences, sometimes forgets: that life itself is precious precisely because it is fragile, that joy is meaningful precisely because sorrow is real, and that hope is powerful precisely because despair is always lurking nearby. Their harsh existence, brutal as it was, taught them to savor the small victories, to find strength in community, and to maintain faith even when circumstances seemed to argue against it. As we close this exploration of life in ancient Israel, we are left with a profound appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit and a deeper understanding of the historical context that shaped some of humanity's most enduring spiritual and cultural traditions. The next time we read the ancient texts that emerged from this land, we will hear them with new ears, understanding the desperate circumstances that gave birth to calls for justice, the harsh realities that made promises of divine provision so precious, and the daily struggles that made hope itself a radical act of faith. The people of ancient Israel faced a world that was brutal beyond our modern comprehension, yet they not only survived but created a legacy of wisdom, faith, and resilience that continues to inspire and guide humanity thousands of years later. In their struggle against overwhelming odds, they discovered truths about the human condition that remain as relevant today as they were in those distant, difficult times. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can endure, communities can support one another, and hope can survive against all odds. And perhaps that is the most important lesson we can take from our journey through this harsh and unforgiving world, that the capacity for survival, for meaning, for love, and for hope exists within us all, waiting to be called forth when circumstances demand it. The people of ancient Israel, in all their suffering and struggle, showed us what it means to be truly human in the face of an often brutal and indifferent world. Their legacy lives on not just in the texts they left behind, but in the example they set of how to endure, how to hope, and how to find meaning even in the midst of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The first light of dawn stretches its pale fingers across the jagged hills of Judah, painting the stone walls of the village in a muted palette of gold and ash. The air is still cool, holding the last traces of night's mercy before the sun begins its unrelenting climb, promising another day of toil under its merciless gaze. In the stillness, before the sounds of labor awaken, there is a fragile silence, broken only by the occasional lowing of a goat or the soft murmur of wind through olive branches. Within one of the village's modest dwellings, built of rough-hewn limestone and clay, a woman named Sarah is already awake. She has been for some time now, as sleep rarely lingers long in the lives of women here. She sits on her heels near the dim glow of an ember-strewn hearth, her hands wrapped tightly around a smooth stone quern. The grinding begins again in slow, deliberate circles. Scrape, 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 as kernels of barley surrender their hard shells beneath the steady rhythm of stone upon stone. The sound is deceptively gentle, yet it carries a weight of urgency that defines every morning in this land. Sarah's shoulders ache from years of this work, her palms calloused and raw where the quern has bitten countless times. Yet she works with practiced grace, her body remembering what her mind barely registers in these early hours. Outside, faint beams of sunlight spill into the courtyard, where chickens stir and peck among the dust, searching for the smallest seeds to fill their fragile crops. Her husband, Joab, shifts on his straw-filled mat in the corner of the room. The air is heavy, with the mingling scents of animals kept nearby for warmth, the sharp musk of goats, the faint ammonia of dung, the lingering aroma of yesterday's bread baked hastily in the clay oven. There is no luxury of separation in these homes. Human and beast share space, air, and often the same meager food. As Joab rises, he pulls a coarse wool tunic over his weathered skin. His hands, cracked and darkened from years of toil, instinctively reach for the water skin. He drinks sparingly, knowing every drop is precious. The winter rains have been poor, and the cistern outside their home has begun to smell faintly of algae, a sign that water levels are dangerously low. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and steps out into the courtyard, where the first true breath of morning greets him with its chill. The courtyard, enclosed by low stone walls, holds their modest wealth. A few scrawny goats, a handful of chickens, and a sheep, so old its wool has begun to thin in patches. Joab kneels beside the smallest goat, his fingers probing its ribs, counting them silently with a farmer's anxiety. There is not enough fodder this year. The hills are too dry, and grazing has been poor. Each animal is a fragile promise of milk, meat, and survival through the lean months ahead. The village itself is waking now. From neighbouring courtyards come the sounds of clinking pots, coughing children, and the soft bleating of animals. Women call softly to one another as they emerge from doorways, balancing clay jars on their heads as they begin the long trek to the nearest well. Their voices carry the lilting cadences of ancient prayers, whispered as they walk barefoot over sharp stones and thorny brush. Children, thin-legged and wide-eyed, run errands for their mothers. One boy, no older than 6, carries an armload of kindling almost too heavy for his small frame. Another girl, her hair tied back with a frayed scrap of linen, kneels to tend a small fire while her baby brother wails on her hip. Childhood in this place offers no reprieve from responsibility. Even the youngest contribute what they can, their innocence tempered by the relentless demands of survival. Back inside, Sarah pauses in her work to glance at her eldest daughter, Miriam, who is kneeling nearby spinning flax into rough thread. The girl's hands are quick but clumsy, her fingers nicked and raw from countless failed attempts. Sarah does not scold. There is no time for harshness here, only the patient urgency of teaching skills that will one day decide whether Miriam's own children survive or starve. The bread Sarah bakes today will be their sustenance for the entire day. The dough is coarse, flecked with bits of chaff from the barley that could not be sifted clean. She shapes small flat discs with care, her mind calculating how many each member of the family might eat, and whether there will be enough left for the evening meal. On lean days, she mixes in lentils or even acorn meal to stretch the precious grain further, though such bread tastes bitter and sits heavy in the belly. Outside, Joab joins other men of the village as they gather tools for the day's labour. Wooden ploughs reinforced with scraps of bronze, stone hoes, baskets woven from reeds. Their conversation is muted and practical, discussions of weather patterns, pest infestations, rumours of raiders sighted near the trade routes. Each man bears the same quiet determination, knowing their families depend on the fruits of their work and that failure is not an option they can afford. As they set out toward the fields, the sun climbs higher and its heat begins to press down on the land like a heavy hand. Already, beads of sweat form on Joab's brow as he walks the narrow path between terraced hillsides, past neighbours tending small vegetable plots of onions, garlic, and bitter greens. He stops briefly to greet Abner, the village elder, who sits hunched near a cistern, his eyes scanning the horizon with a worried squint. The elder remembers famines of his youth, years when families buried more children than they raised, and his face carries the weight of those memories. By midday, the village hums with the sounds of ceaseless labour. Women return from the well, clay jars balanced expertly despite the treacherous paths. Their shoulders ache from the burden, but there is no rest. Water must be boiled, animals watered, children fed. Bread must be baked before the afternoon heat renders the oven too dangerous to use. Sarah wipes her brow as she pulls the first loaves from the oven, their crusts blistered and fragrant, despite the bitterness of the lentil flour mixed within. She sets them on a rough-hewn table, glancing out the doorway toward the fields where Joab and the others work. Her heart tightens with familiar worry. The barley harvest will be poor this year. She has seen too many lean seasons to ignore the signs. Stunted stalks, thin heads of grain, clouds that pass without releasing a single drop of rain. Evening is still hours away, yet the weight of the day already presses down on her like the heat of the sun outside. She straightens her back, rolls her aching shoulders, and returns to the quern. The scraping sound begins again, a steady rhythm that carries her through her thoughts like a heartbeat. This is the daily grind of ancient Israel, not the romanticized life of prophets and kings, but the quiet, unseen labor of countless ordinary people. Their hands, cracked and calloused, built the world that would one day birth legends. Their struggle was not grand or glorious, but it was unceasing, and it was essential. The passage of time in ancient Israel is marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the shifting moods of the land itself. Here, the seasons are more than mere divisions of the year. They are arbiters of life and death, of abundance and famine, of celebration and mourning. Each carries its own rhythms, its own blessings, and its own cruelties, shaping the lives of those who inhabit this unforgiving terrain. Spring comes first, tentative and uncertain. It arrives with cool winds that sweep down from the mountains, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faintest hint of blossoms. In years when the rains have been kind, the hills burst into a fleeting green, dotted with wildflowers that seem too delicate for a place so harsh. Sheep graze on tender shoots of grass, their bleating mingling with the laughter of children who chase one another between rows of barley, their bare feet soft against the damp soil. But even in spring, anxiety lingers like a shadow. Too much rain can wash away fragile seedlings, turning fields into muddy wastelands. Too little, and the promise of life withers before it can take hold. Joab watches the sky daily, reading the clouds as his father taught him, searching for signs of storms that might nourish or destroy. The villagers gather at dusk in whispered prayers, asking their God to grant just enough rain and not a drop more. Summer follows swiftly, and with it comes the oppressive heat. The air grows thick and still, heavy with the scent of dust and sweat. By mid-morning, the sun stands like a fiery sentinel overhead, searing the earth until the hills crack and the once green pastures turn to brittle straw. Children no longer run barefoot. The ground burns their souls, forcing them to tread carefully in shaded paths. In the fields, Joab and the other men labor shirtless under the unrelenting blaze, their skin darkened and cracked by the sun. They swing their hoes and sickles with measured precision, conserving strength for the long days ahead. Each stroke of the sickle feels like a prayer, each bundle of grain a fragile hope against the threat of famine. Water becomes the most precious of all commodities during these months. Sarah rises before dawn to fill her clay jar at the village well, knowing that by afternoon, the queue of women will stretch for hours and tempers will fray. The cisterns that caught winter's rains now lie nearly empty, their walls crusted with salt and algae. Families ration every drop, reusing water for washing and cooking until it grows cloudy and sour. With the heat come locusts. Clouds of the voracious insects sometimes darken the sky, descending upon fields in an unstoppable tide of wings and mandibles. Joab has seen it before, green barley fields reduced to bare stalks in a single afternoon, the air alive with the crackle of countless jaws. When locusts come, there is no defense, no prayer that can turn them aside. Families can only watch, hearts sinking as the fruits of their labor vanish into the insatiable swarm. Autumn brings a brief reprieve, a season of frantic harvest and cautious celebration. The air cools, and the first rains moisten the parched soil, releasing the scent of earth long denied water. It is a time of long days and longer nights, as every able-bodied villager works to gather and store whatever the land has yielded. Granaries fill with barley and wheat, jars with olive oil and honey, baskets with figs and dates dried carefully in the sun. Sarah works tirelessly during these weeks, her hands rough and raw from weaving baskets and pressing olives. She teaches Miriam how to seal jars of pickled vegetables with wax, how to layer dried herbs between meats to preserve them for the coming winter. Each task carries a sense of urgency. There is no room for error. Spoilage or infestation in the stores could mean hunger when the cold months come. In the evenings, after the day's work is done, the village gathers to share stories and songs. Children's voices rise in laughter as they play simple games with stones and sticks, their stomachs full for the first time in weeks. But even in these moments of joy, there is restraint. Everyone knows how quickly fortune can change in this land. Winter is the true test. It descends not with snow, but with chilling winds and unrelenting rains that flood low-lying fields and seep through cracks in the stone houses. Fires burn constantly in the hearths, but the smoke often fills the rooms, stinging eyes and coating walls with soot. Families huddle together for warmth, their bodies pressed close in the narrow spaces that serve as both bedroom and barn. The elderly suffer most in winter, their joints aching from the damp, their strength sapped by long nights on cold floors. Children cough in the dark, their breath visible in the icy air. The food stores gathered in autumn slowly dwindle. Each meal becomes smaller than the last. Bread slices thinner, bowls of porridge more watery. Hunger grows as an unwelcome guest, settling into every home. In bad years, famine follows close on the heels of winter's chill. Sarah has seen it before. Neighbours wasting away, their eyes hollow, their skins stretched tight over protruding bones. She remembers the winter when her own brother died of hunger, his small body wrapped in rags too thin to keep out the cold. That memory never leaves her, a constant reminder of how fragile life is in this place. The seasons turn in this endless cycle, each bringing its own trials, each demanding sacrifices from those who live upon the land. Yet through it all, the people endure. They endure because they must, because there is no other choice. They find beauty in fleeting moments. The scent of freshly baked bread, the laughter of a child chasing chickens through the courtyard, the first fat drops of rain splashing onto dry, cracked earth. They take comfort in their rituals, lighting the Sabbath lamps, singing psalms beneath the stars, sharing a rare fig or handful of nuts as a family gathers close for warmth. This is how they survive the seasons of fear and hope, not through strength alone, but through resilience born of generations who faced the same struggles and taught their children how to face them too. As the stars emerge one by one in the night sky, they offer a gentle reminder that even in the darkest seasons, light endures. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but for now, there is a moment of peace, a moment to breathe deeply and be grateful for the simple miracle of life continuing in a world that asks so much. The cycle of life in ancient Israel was as fragile and unpredictable as the land itself, a rhythm of beginnings and endings played out against the backdrop of an unforgiving world. To be born in this place was to enter a life defined by struggle from the very first breath, and to die was not an unexpected tragedy, but the inevitable conclusion of a hard and uncertain journey. It begins in the darkness of a modest home. The air is thick with the scent of burning olive oil and the acrid smoke of dung-fueled fires. In a small upper room, Sarah's sister, Rebecca, lies on a straw-filled mat, her face slick with sweat, her hands gripping the edges of a coarse wool blanket as wave after wave of pain racks her weary body. This is her 6th pregnancy, and though she has borne children before, each labour carries the same edge of fear, the same whispered prayers for mercy. Around her, 3 other women work with quiet urgency. One kneels at Rebecca's side, wiping her brow with a damp cloth and murmuring encouragement. Another tends a pot of water heating over a brazier, the steam rising faintly in the dim light. The eldest, a midwife whose wrinkled hands have delivered dozens of children, positions herself with calm precision, her eyes scanning Rebecca's face for any sign of trouble. There is no physician here, no sterile instruments, no understanding of bacteria or infection. Only the midwife's experience and a few herbs, myrrh for the pain, frankincense to ease breathing, and a bitter tea of hyssop leaves meant to strengthen contractions. The women's voices blend with Rebecca's laboured breaths, forming a rhythm that fills the room. Whisper, moan, prayer, silence. Outside, the village continues its ceaseless toil, unaware of the drama unfolding within these stone walls. Children run barefoot in the courtyard, their laughter ringing out beneath a sky that blazes with the midday sun. Men in the fields drive their ploughs through stubborn soil, their sweat mingling with dust as they coax life from the reluctant earth. Hours pass. Rebecca's cries grow louder, her strength waning. The midwife whispers a prayer to El Shaddai, the Almighty, and presses her hands gently against the straining belly. At last, with one final wrenching effort, a child slips into the world. For a moment, there is only silence. Then a thin, reedy wail fills the room, fragile yet defiant against the heavy air. The women exhale as one, their tense shoulders relaxing. The midwife cleans the newborn with rough linen, swaddles him tightly, and lays him on Rebecca's chest. Mother and child lie together, their breaths shallow but steady. But not every birth ends so well. In this land, the spectre of death hovers closely over every cradle. Many infants fail to draw their first breath. Others are claimed by fevers or infections in the days and weeks that follow. Mothers, too, are at constant risk. A hemorrhage, a breech birth, a simple infection can turn a moment of joy into a scene of mourning. The village has seen it too many times. Fathers bury wives in shallow graves on the hillside, their tears mingling with dust as they stand beside tiny bundles wrapped in linen, lowered gently into the earth. Sarah remembers the year when 3 women died in childbirth in the same season. Their names whispered with reverence and fear in every household. The cycle continues. Those who survive infancy grow into children marked by the harshness of their world. Hollow-eyed from hunger, their ribs visible beneath thin skin, they carry in their small bodies the weight of generations who fought to endure. Childhood illnesses claim many before their 10th year. A cough can turn to pneumonia. A minor cut can fester and spread fever through a young body too weak to fight. Parents watch helplessly, their prayers unanswered as tiny chests rise and fall in erratic patterns, until finally they rise no more. For those who reach adulthood, life becomes a ceaseless struggle to provide and protect. Men's bodies harden from labor, backs bent, hands calloused, shoulders permanently stooped from years of carrying water, stones, and burdens too heavy to name. Women's faces age quickly, their skin weathered by sun and wind, their eyes lined with fatigue from endless cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, and caregiving. The elderly are rare. To reach 50 is a sign of divine favor, a blessing whispered about in hushed voices. Grandparents, when they live, are revered repositories of wisdom, their stories and advice carrying weight born of survival. But even their twilight years are not gentle. Arthritis stiffens joints, cataracts cloud vision, malnutrition weakens bones until a simple fall can be fatal. Death is no stranger in these homes. It arrives quietly in the night or suddenly in the heat of the day. It may come in the form of fever, or an accident in the fields, or the blade of an enemy's sword. There are no physicians, no remedies beyond what the land provides. When death comes, families respond with ritual, washing the body in precious water, wrapping it in clean linen, placing it in the earth with prayers and tears. The entire village often gathers for mourning, their wails rising together in a raw chorus that echoes off the hillsides. Grief is communal here, for every death diminishes the fragile fabric of their survival. Yet amid the sorrow, life persists. A widow carries on raising her children alone, neighbors bringing her food and helping tend her fields. A young couple conceives again after losing a child, their hope a fragile ember against the cold shadow of memory. Babies are born, elders pass on, the seasons turn again. This is the cycle of life in ancient Israel. Birth and death intertwined so closely that joy and sorrow become indistinguishable. Each breath taken is a small triumph. Each heartbeat is a defiance of the odds. As we reflect on these lives, so brief, so filled with hardship, we begin to see not only the fragility of existence, but also its astonishing resilience. The people of this land endured because they had no choice. They found strength in family, in faith, in the small moments of beauty scattered like wildflowers across their days. Tonight, as you rest in the safety of your own world, consider how precious that safety truly is. The people of ancient Israel could only dream of a life free from the constant spectre of death. And yet, even in their harsh reality, they cherished each sunrise, each newborn's cry, each moment when all their children lived and laughed beneath the stars. In the quiet hours of morning, before the heat begins to press down on the land like an invisible hand, the voices of children echo faintly across the rocky terraces of ancient Israel. Their laughter rings out in fleeting bursts, bright and fragile, like the first blooms of spring clinging stubbornly to cracks in the sun-baked soil. For a moment, it seems as if the weight of this harsh world has not yet found them. But even in their laughter, there is an undertone of urgency, of small bodies already learning the rhythms of survival. Childhood here is short, and innocence even shorter. In a modest courtyard, a boy no older than 7 kneels barefoot in the dust, carefully shaping a small flock of goats from hardened mud and straw. His name is Levi, and his hands, tiny, calloused, and already cracked from exposure, move with surprising precision. As he arranges his toy animals in a line, he hums a tune his mother once sang to soothe him during feverish nights. But his play is not mere amusement. It is practice. He is rehearsing the life that will soon be his, tending imaginary flocks just as his father tends real ones in the hills beyond. Beside him, his younger sister Miriam, still with the roundness of babyhood in her cheeks, clutches a rag doll stitched from scraps of worn linen. She rocks it in her arms, whispering in a language of half-formed words, her wide eyes already mirroring the watchfulness of her mother. She will not stay small for long. Soon, she will join Sarah and the other women at the quern, her tiny hands reddened by the constant scraping of grain, her days dictated by the endless tasks of food, water, and fire. Across the village, other children emerge from low doorways, rubbing sleep from their eyes, their thin limbs taut with the wiry strength born of hunger and hard living. Some carry bundles of firewood, their steps careful over the rocky paths. Others fetch water, clay jars balanced precariously on heads not yet grown steady enough for the task. For these children, play is a stolen luxury, woven between duties that would seem insurmountable to any modern notion of childhood. Yet, when the rare moment comes, their games echo the adult world around them. Boys gather pebbles and fashion slings, testing their aim on distant tree trunks, pretending to drive off raiders or hunt wolves. Girls kneel in the dust, arranging piles of stones and twigs into the semblance of cooking fires, practicing the motions of grinding, kneading, and tending that will one day fill their waking hours. Illness is never far. Levi's younger brother, barely 4, lies on a mat in the corner of their home. His small chest rises and falls with shallow breaths, his skin hot and flushed from the fever that has held him in its grip for 3 days. Sarah sits beside him, her hand resting gently on his damp forehead as she murmurs prayers beneath her breath. She remembers 2 other children who did not survive their 5th year. In this land, a parent's love is mingled always with fear. The spectre of disease shapes childhood from the beginning. Infants often arrive in this world too small, their cries weak, their bodies unable to withstand the infections and fevers that sweep so easily through crowded dwellings. Those who survive the first years grow lean and strong if they are fortunate, but the scars of childhood illness remain visible, pockmarks from fevers, blindness from untreated infections, and bowed legs from malnutrition. Education is practical, immediate, and unrelenting. By 5 or 6, boys are learning their father's trade, tending flocks, repairing tools, understanding the delicate balance between the demands of animals and the limits of the land. They listen as fathers speak of raiders, of drought, of the price of wool at distant markets. Knowledge is survival here. Girls, meanwhile, absorb the secrets of the home. They learn which herbs can ease a cough, how to boil water over a dung fire without wasting precious fuel, how to weave baskets tight enough to hold grain. Older sisters become surrogate mothers, their childish voices echoing the scoldings and lullabies of their own mothers as they tend to younger siblings. There is no concept of a protected childhood in this place. Each child is seen as both a blessing and a necessary worker, a future pillar of the family's survival. Parents love their children deeply, but with a guardedness born of hard experience. Too many have buried infants beneath cairns of stones on wind-swept hillsides to allow their hearts to remain unguarded. And yet, there are moments of light. At dusk, when the day's labor finally ceases, children gather in the village square. They chase each other in circles, their bare feet kicking up tiny clouds of dust that glow in the amber light. Laughter bursts from their thin chests like birds startled into flight. Someone begins a song and others join, their voices weaving together into a melody older than memory. An elder, stooped and soft-spoken, calls the children to his side and begins to tell a story. It is a tale of giants and kings, of battles fought and won, of a god who parted seas and spoke from mountaintops. The children listen, eyes wide, their fingers playing idly with bits of straw and clay as they lose themselves in the imagined world of miracles and heroes. These stories are not merely entertainment. They are lessons in courage, faith, and endurance, the inheritance of a people who have survived through countless trials. The night grows cooler. Mothers call softly for their children to return, guiding them back into dimly lit homes where the smell of flatbread and lentil stew lingers. As they curl on straw mats, sleep takes them quickly. Their dreams, if they come, are filled with images of flocks and fields, of rivers flowing plentiful, and skies heavy with promised rain. This is childhood in ancient Israel, fleeting, fragile, and yet luminous in its own quiet way. The laughter of these children, though rare and delicate, carries a defiance that no famine, no plague, no enemy sword can fully extinguish. It is the sound of life insisting on itself, of hope whispered in the face of unrelenting hardship. The sun is high now, its searing light flattening the hills and valleys into a harsh, blinding landscape. The air is heavy and still, the kind of oppressive stillness that seems to press against the skin, making every breath feel weighted. Even the goats in the courtyard stand motionless, their sides rising and falling in slow, shallow rhythms as flies dance around their twitching ears. Joab wipes the sweat from his brow as he works in his barley field, his hands red and raw from the rough wooden handle of his hoe. The soil here is stubborn, packed hard by weeks without rain, and every stroke sends up small puffs of dust that coat his skin and cling to the stubble of his beard. He straightens for a moment to stretch his aching back and squints toward the northern hills, his eyes narrowing as he catches sight of something, no, someone, moving along the ridge. At first, it's only a dark smudge against the pale rock, but then more figures emerge, silhouettes that shift and coalesce into the unmistakable shape of armed men. Joab's stomach tightens. They are too far away to make out details, but the movement alone is enough to send his thoughts racing. He has heard the stories, passed quietly from mouth to ear in the village square, of Philistine raiding parties sweeping down from the coastal plains, of Ammonite bands crossing the Jordan to steal livestock and burn homes, of bands of outlaws, men with nothing left to lose, prowling the hills like wolves. His mind drifts to the memory of his own childhood, when a raid had struck their village in the dead of night. He still remembers the screaming, the smell of burning thatch, the cold terror as he and his mother fled into the hills, while his father stayed behind with only a dull bronze sickle to defend their home. That night had left scars deeper than any wound. Joab drops his hoe and begins walking quickly toward the village, his legs moving before his mind has fully decided. In the village square, word spreads fast. Abner, the elder whose beard has grown white from years of surviving such threats, calls the men together. His voice is calm, but carries an undercurrent of urgency. The scouts have seen movement, he says, his eyes scanning the circle of faces around him. Armed men on the northern ridge. We don't know their intent, but we must prepare as if they come for us. The preparations are swift and practiced. They have done this before. Mothers gather their children and begin packing what little they can carry. Dried barley, clay jars of water, the family's one change of clothing, and small heirlooms, bits of bronze jewelry, carved wooden idols, a scrap of linen embroidered by a grandmother long since gone. Sarah moves through her home like a woman possessed, her hands trembling as she wraps a few loaves of flatbread in cloth and tucks them into a woven basket. She glances over at Miriam, who clutches her little brother tightly, her wide eyes betraying the fear she tries to suppress. "Quickly, my child," Sarah whispers, forcing her voice into a semblance of calm. "We may need to run to the caves." The caves. Every villager knows their location, hidden among the rocky outcrops a few hours' walk to the east. They are small, dark, and damp, but they have saved lives before. Families hide there when raiders come, waiting in breathless silence as the sounds of chaos echo through the hills. Shouting men, the crackle of burning thatch, the terrified bleating of animals driven off as plunder. The men check their weapons, pitifully few and mostly crude. Bronze-tipped spears that have seen better days, a scattering of slings and stones, and a single iron sword, a prized heirloom kept in Abner's house since his father's time. Joab fingers the worn leather strap of his sling, his stomach twisting at the thought of facing hardened warriors with nothing more than a smooth river stone. But he knows he must stand with the others. As afternoon fades into evening, the men take positions along the outskirts of the village, their eyes fixed on the distant hills. Every movement, every shadow seems charged with threat. Time stretches painfully, each minute drawn out like the tightening of a bowstring. In the homes, the women huddle with their children, whispering prayers to the God of their fathers, praying for deliverance as their ancestors had in Egypt, in the wilderness, in countless forgotten battles. Sarah clutches her youngest to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of his tiny heart against her ribs. She remembers the stories her grandmother told of raids where entire families were carried off, women and children taken as slaves, men slaughtered where they stood. She forces the thought away, pressing her lips to her son's hair. But the night passes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the threat recedes. No torchlights descend from the hills. No shouts break the uneasy silence. Only the distant howl of a jackal punctuates the darkness. At dawn, scouts return with news. The armed men have moved on, their path veering east toward the Jordan. They were likely traders' guards or a raiding band seeking easier prey. The village is safe, for now. Relief spreads in a wave so strong it leaves many weak-kneed and trembling. Women weep openly as they unpack their baskets. Children laugh and run into the square, their fear already forgotten. The men return from their posts, silent and grim, knowing this reprieve may only be temporary. Abner gathers them one last time. His words are simple. Today we were spared. Tomorrow may be different. Be vigilant. As the sun rises higher, life in the village resumes its steady rhythm, yet the undercurrent of fear lingers. For in this land, peace is never certain, and safety is never absolute. The memory of potential violence hangs heavy in every heart, a silent reminder that survival in ancient Israel demands not only hard work, but constant vigilance. This is the world Joab's children inherit, a place where the sound of hoofbeats on distant hills can turn a peaceful morning into a day of terror. And yet, in their resilience, in the way they gather, prepare, defend, they find the fragile strength that has allowed their people to endure generation after generation. It was not faith in the abstract sense that we might understand today, but a visceral, all-consuming force woven into every aspect of their existence. For them, faith was as necessary as bread, as vital as water, as sustaining as the air they breathed. It gave structure to their days, meaning to their suffering, and hope to their fragile lives. The first sacred rhythm was the Sabbath. Every seventh day, as the sun dipped behind the Judean hills and shadows stretched long across the terraced fields, the village would pause. The ceaseless grinding of grain would cease, the clatter of tools would grow silent, and even the animals seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm. Sarah, her hands rough and cracked from endless work, would light the small clay lamp in her home, its flickering flame casting long shadows against the stone walls. She would murmur blessings in a voice hoarse from a week of labor. The words passed down from mother to daughter, like an heirloom too precious to lose. The Sabbath was not a luxury. It was a commandment, a gift, a moment of stillness in a world that offered few. On this day, even the poorest laborer, even the weary slave, was given the right to rest. Bread, baked the day before, sat ready in baskets. Simple stews simmered in clay pots, their aromas filling the air. Children, usually pressed into small, hands-on tasks, were allowed to sit and listen to stories, their eyes wide as they drifted between wakefulness and dreams. Joab would take this time to teach his son Levi the ancient words of Psalms, their cadences rising like a prayer and settling like a balm over hearts worn raw by fear. But beyond the weekly Sabbath lay the festivals, holy days that stitched the cycles of agriculture and worship into a single tapestry of meaning. In the spring came Pesach, the Passover, a time of remembrance and deliverance. Families would gather in their homes to eat unleavened bread, its bitter taste a reminder of suffering endured and freedom won. Lambs were slaughtered with reverence, their blood painted on doorposts in a ritual that reached back through centuries. In midsummer came Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, marking the wheat harvest and the giving of the Torah. Villagers would bring their first fruits to the elders as offerings of gratitude, their baskets heavy with figs, dates, and olives. The air would be alive with the sound of songs sung in unison, voices rising to heaven as if to remind God of his covenant. And in autumn, there was Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, when families would build small booths outside their homes, fragile shelters of palm fronds and reeds that echoed the wanderings of their ancestors in the wilderness. For 7 nights, they would sleep beneath the stars, children gazing in wonder at the constellations their forefathers once followed. It was a reminder that all homes, no matter how sturdy, were temporary. Faith was not merely ritual, it was woven into the very fabric of survival. When the rains failed and famine stalked the hills, when disease spread through the village like fire, the people cried out to their God with an urgency born of desperation. Joab's voice would rise with the others in lamentation, the sounds of mourning and pleading indistinguishable. They would gather at the edge of the fields, faces turned skyward, asking for rain, for mercy, for a reprieve from the relentless suffering of this land. At night, Sarah would whisper prayers over her sleeping children, her voice barely audible above their soft, rhythmic breathing. She asked not for abundance, but only for enough food to see them through the winter, enough health to survive the next wave of sickness, enough peace to raise her children without the shadow of violence at their door. There were sacred places too, hilltop altars built of rough stones where offerings of grain, oil, and sometimes animals were left for the God they believed walked unseen among them. These altars smelled of smoke and blood, of sanctity and fear intermingled. Levi remembers the first time he saw his father bring a lamb to the altar. The boy had watched silently as Joab's strong hands that gently cradled his infant brother only days earlier, now held the lamb steady while its lifeblood poured onto the stones. The act seemed brutal and holy all at once, a reminder that life was fragile and survival often demanded sacrifice. But faith also brought comfort in ways more subtle. The Psalms, sung in low voices as families gathered in the evenings, carried words of longing, of trust, of endurance. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. These were not mere songs, but survival tools, mantras that tethered weary minds to hope when circumstances threatened to sever all ties. The elders told stories of prophets and kings, of divine interventions and miraculous deliverance. These tales were more than entertainment. They were a blueprint for resilience. Children like Miriam, listening wide-eyed to her grandmother's recounting of Moses parting the sea, learned that despair was not the end, that their people had endured worse and emerged still standing. Faith even found its way into the most mundane of tasks. The washing of hands before a meal, the tithing of grain, the weaving of linen fringes on garments, all became small acts of devotion, daily reminders of a covenant that promised meaning amidst hardship. Even the rhythms of birth and death, so harsh in this place, were wrapped in sacred rites. Infants were named with blessings whispered over them, their tiny foreheads kissed by mothers who prayed they would live long enough to speak those blessings aloud one day. The dead were mourned in loud, keening wails, their bodies washed and wrapped with care before being laid to rest in rocky tombs, as prayers rose to a heaven that seemed both near and impossibly far. For the people of ancient Israel, faith did not shield them from suffering. It did not prevent famine or plague, nor did it stay the hands of raiders, but it gave them something far more essential, a framework for enduring, for finding meaning in the senseless, for believing, against all evidence, that life was worth living, that the struggle was not in vain. As the stars blossomed in the night sky, countless and silent, they seemed to echo the unspoken prayers of a people who had learned to survive not by strength alone, but by the steady heartbeat of faith. And so, as you listen now in the stillness of your own night, perhaps you too can hear it, the faint whisper of those sacred rhythms, the timeless melody of human hope rising softly from the hills of a long-ago land. The village of ancient Israel might seem, at first glance, like a world unto itself. Nestled in the hills, hemmed in by dry stone walls and fields of barley, it is easy to believe that life begins and ends within these narrow borders. But beyond the olive groves and terraced slopes, a larger world stirs. A world of great empires, of distant cities whose names carry the weight of power and wealth, of caravans that snake across deserts, like lifelines connecting one fragile existence to another. And though Joab's family lives simply, their lives are inescapably tied to this broader world. It begins with a sound, faint at first, then growing, the steady clink of metal against wood, the muffled thud of hooves on hardened earth, the low murmur of foreign voices carried on a dry wind. Children stop their play and look up. Women pause at the well, hands tightening on their clay jars. Even the elders straighten in their seats, their lined faces wary and curious in equal measure. A caravan is approaching. The first animals crest the hill, long-legged camels laden with bundles of textiles, jars of oil, sacks of grain. Behind them walk men in layered tunics of unfamiliar cut, their heads wrapped in cloth against the sun, their eyes scanning the village with practiced caution. The air carries scents not native to these hills: frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and the faint tang of salt from distant shores. There are flashes of colour too, dyed fabrics in deep reds and brilliant blues, bronze trinkets glinting from leather belts, beads and amulets strung across animals' necks. For the children, the sight is almost magical. Little Miriam grips her mother's hand tightly, her wide eyes drinking in the spectacle as a merchant offers a piece of dried date to a boy no older than herself. The boy hesitates, glances at his mother, then takes it with both hands as if it were a priceless treasure. Trade is both lifeline and danger. For a farmer like Joab, the arrival of a caravan might mean access to iron tools stronger than his bronze hoe, to salt that can preserve precious meat through the heat of summer, to rare seeds that promise a richer harvest. But it might also mean risk, higher prices when goods are scarce, disease carried by strangers, tensions over water and grazing rights as the caravan animals drink deeply from the village's already strained cisterns. Joab steps forward with the other men, their faces stern but voices polite as they greet the caravan leader. Trade negotiations are a delicate dance. He offers 2 skeins of hand-spun wool, bartered from his wife's tireless labour at the loom, in exchange for a small pouch of salt and a sliver of iron to mend his sickle blade. The merchant's dark eyes flicker as he calculates, his fingers brushing the wool with practiced familiarity. Around them, other transactions unfold. A woman trades a clay pot of olive oil for a handful of dried figs. An elder barters 3 jars of honey for a small bronze idol said to bring protection against fever. Each exchange carries weight, every item tied to hours of sweat and sacrifice. But the world that trade brings is not always benign. With the caravans come rumors of distant wars, of Egyptian pharaohs marching north, of Assyrian kings expanding their borders, of Babylonian merchants fleeing cities laid waste by enemy armies. These tales drift through the village like dry leaves on the wind, stirring unease. Sarah listens as women at the well whisper of a town 2 days' journey away, where raiders ambushed a caravan and carried off both goods and people. She clutches her jar tighter, imagining what such violence would mean if it came here. Disease too follows the traders' paths. An illness that began in the markets of Damascus might spread unseen with every handshake, every shared cup of wine, until it reaches even these remote hills. Parents keep their children close when strangers arrive, their eyes watchful for the first signs of cough or fever. And yet, despite the dangers, trade connects this small village to something greater. Through it, they glimpse worlds beyond their own. Bustling ports where ships crowd the harbours, mountain passes where snow never melts, cities where temples rise like mountains of stone. Even Joab, who has never travelled beyond the neighbouring valley, knows the names of Tyre and Sidon, of Nineveh and Memphis. He knows them not because he has seen them, but because they exist in the whispers of traders and in the goods they carry. For the children, trade brings not just survival, but wonder. Levi marvels at a small carved lion offered by a passing merchant. Its mane is etched with fine detail, its eyes inlaid with tiny chips of obsidian. He has never seen a lion in his young life, though he has heard his father's stories of beasts prowling the hills in lean winters. To hold this small representation feels like touching a piece of the larger world. Miriam, clutching her rag doll, watches as a woman from the caravan arranges beads of glass in the sun. The colours, deep cobalt, soft amber, brilliant green, seem impossibly vivid in the harsh light of midday. She wonders what it would be like to wear such beauty, to see the world through eyes unburdened by hunger and fear. As the sun sinks toward the horizon, the merchants pack their wares once more. Their animals groan as heavy loads are secured. Voices rise in sharp commands as drivers prepare for the long road ahead. The villagers watch in silence as the caravan disappears beyond the hills, leaving behind the faint scent of spices and the quiet return of their own routine. The world has brushed against theirs, and now it moves on. For Joab's family, the goods exchanged today may be the difference between hardship and disaster in the months ahead. A repaired sickle may mean a better harvest. Salt may preserve enough meat to feed his children through the winter. But there is more to it than trade. There is the reminder that beyond these hills, beyond the dry valleys and parched fields, lies a world vast and interconnected, a world that brings both peril and promise. The people of ancient Israel live poised between the isolation of their villages and the pull of this larger reality. And in that tension, they find both fear and hope. As night falls, Sarah lights the small oil lamp in their home. Its flickering glow casts long shadows as she whispers a prayer of gratitude, not for abundance, but for enough. Enough grain to survive, enough tools to work the land, enough peace to sleep without fear of raiders tonight, and perhaps enough hope to believe that tomorrow's caravan might bring not just goods, but news of a safer, kinder world beyond these hills. The village sleeps under a sky scattered with stars so bright they seem almost close enough to touch. The faint hum of insects rises and falls in the cool night air, blending with the soft rustle of olive branches in the breeze. From somewhere in the distance, a jackal calls, its haunting cry drifting over the hills like a ghost of the wilderness beyond. But inside the small stone homes of the village, sleep does not come easily for all. Joab lies awake on his straw mat, staring at the rough ceiling beams. His body aches from the day's labour, muscles tight and sore, but his mind will not rest. He replays the events of the day, the hard bargain trade with the merchant, the wary watch for raiders, the endless questions from his son Levi about why some children in the village no longer play in the square. The weight of survival presses on him like a second skin. He feels it in the tightness of his chest as he calculates how long their grain stores might last, in the ache of his shoulders as he remembers carrying his sick child to the healer last winter, in the silent fear that gnaws at him each time the sky refuses rain. He thinks of his father and his father's father, men who lived and worked and died under the same sun, who faced the same fears and yet endured. He wonders if he has inherited their strength or if he will be the one to falter. Sarah, too, lies awake. She can feel the gentle rise and fall of her youngest son's breath against her arm. Hear Miriam's soft murmurs as the girl dreams beside her. She wants to believe these small signs of life are promises, that her children will grow strong, that they will live to see seasons of abundance. But she knows the truth. She has buried 2 children already, their small bodies wrapped in linen and laid beneath a cairn of stones on the hillside. She remembers the hollow look in their eyes, the way their hands felt too light when she lifted them. That memory never leaves her. Still, she endures. She must. Each day, she rises before dawn and begins again, grinding grain, fetching water, tending to her children and her husband. The work is endless, but within its rhythm there is comfort. To keep her hands busy is to keep despair at bay. The village as a whole carries this quiet, collective weight. It is a weight not often spoken aloud, but felt in the hunched backs of the men as they return from the fields, in the silent glances exchanged by women at the well, in the way children play their games with a seriousness that seems beyond their years. There is an unspoken understanding here that life is fragile, that joy must be grasped in fleeting moments before it slips away. And yet, there are moments of light. In the evenings after the day's work has ended, families gather outside their homes. A cool breeze carries away the heat of the day, as children chase one another in the dust, their laughter ringing out like music. Mothers sit weaving or mending garments by the dim glow of oil lamps, their hands moving deftly even as their minds drift. Fathers speak softly in low tones, sharing news from the fields or recounting stories from their youth. These small moments, so easily overlooked, are their balm. A shared meal of lentil stew and flatbread becomes a feast when stomachs are full and hearts are at peace, even briefly. The sight of a newborn goat taking its first unsteady steps brings smiles to faces hardened by years of toil. A passing cloud, heavy with the promise of rain, can spark a prayer whispered with trembling lips. This is how they survive, not just through strength of body, but through resilience of spirit. There are no illusions of safety here. Every villager knows how swiftly disaster can come. Famine, disease, raiders, each is a constant presence, like a shadow at the edge of their vision. They have learned to live with this uncertainty, to fold it into their daily existence like the bitter herbs they eat at Passover, a reminder of suffering and endurance intertwined. They have learned to temper hope with caution, to love fiercely but guardedly, knowing how easily loss can rip through their homes, to find beauty in the smallest blessings, because they know how rare and precious they are. Even the children, though too young to name this weight, feel it. Levi sometimes wakes at night, heart pounding, after dreams of men with swords and burning fields. Miriam holds her ragdoll close, whispering prayers she barely understands for her baby brother's health. Their games often mimic the serious world of adults, one child pretending to be a farmer, another playing the role of a mother tending to a sick child. And yet they laugh. They still laugh. Their laughter is softer than that of children in safer times, but it carries a defiance that speaks of a people who have endured much and will endure more. The elders speak of resilience as a sacred inheritance. Abner, the village elder, tells the younger men, "Our fathers survived the wilderness, the plagues, the wars. We are their sons. As long as we draw breath, we will not surrender." His words are not loud or dramatic, but steady, like the heartbeat of the community itself. In this way, the people of ancient Israel endure the weight of survival. Not because they are without fear or sorrow, but because they have learned to live alongside them, to keep moving forward even when the road is hard and the burden heavy. Their strength is quiet, uncelebrated, often unseen by the wider world. But it is real. It is the kind of strength that carries a family through famine, that rebuilds homes after raids, that cradles the sick with tender hands even knowing death may come. It is the strength of a people who have suffered much, yet still gather at dusk to sing psalms beneath the stars, their voices rising like smoke to the heavens. As the night deepens, the village grows silent. One by one, oil lamps are extinguished, leaving only the glow of embers and the pale light of the moon. Within these humble stone walls, families curl together on mats of straw and wool, their breaths slowing in unison as sleep claims them at last. And though the weight of survival will return with the morning sun, for now there is only this, the soft rhythm of life continuing against all odds. The night in ancient Israel arrives slowly, with a hush that settles over the hills like a heavy wool cloak. The last rays of sunlight bleed out of the western sky, leaving only a faint glow along the horizon. A cool breeze stirs the dry grass, carrying with it the faint sense of earth, smoke, and the musk of animals bedded down for the night. In the village, the day's labour has ended, and with it, the relentless noise of survival. The clatter of querns grinding grain, the bleating of goats, the murmurs of bartering at the gates. In their place comes a quieter rhythm, the crackle of fires kindled in stone hearths, the low hum of voices, the soft rustle of children being settled onto straw mats for sleep. But not all sleep comes easily here. For some, the darkness outside feels too thick, too full of imagined dangers, raiders waiting beyond the hills, wild beasts prowling the terraced fields, unseen forces that whisper through the olive groves. To drive away such fears, the people turn to an ancient remedy, stories. The families gather close around the hearths, their faces lit by the flickering glow of oil lamps and smouldering embers. Shadows dance across the rough limestone walls, stretching and shrinking as flames rise and fall. In Joab's home, Sarah cradles her youngest against her chest, humming a soft lullaby in a language so old its words feel more like sighs than syllables. Levi and Miriam lean against their father's side, their eyes wide and heavy-lidded as they wait for what always comes next. Joab clears his throat, his voice deep and low, meant to soothe as much as to tell. "Tonight," he says, "I will tell you the story of Gideon." The tale unfolds slowly, like the unrolling of a scroll. There was a time, Joab says, when the land was overrun by enemies, the Midianites, fierce and merciless, sweeping down from the hills like a plague of locusts. They burned fields, stole flocks, and left families to starve. The people cried out to God, and he answered, not with armies or kings, but with a simple man threshing wheat in secret, fearful of being seen. This man, Gideon, was no warrior, but God called him mighty and sent him to lead his people. Joab's voice drops lower as he tells of Gideon's tests of faith. The fleece wet with dew while the ground remained dry, then dry while the ground was wet. Each moment carries a quiet awe, a reminder of divine patience with human doubt. Levi listens with wide eyes, imagining himself as Gideon, clutching a ram's horn and torch, standing in the darkness as the Midianites' camp lay unaware. Miriam, clutching her rag doll, holds her breath as Joab speaks of the moment Gideon's 300 men shattered jars, blew their horns, and sent the enemy fleeing in terror. In another home, an elder woman tells a different story. Her voice is cracked with age, but her words are steady, carrying memories of a time before the children around her were born. She speaks of Ruth, a woman of Moab who left her homeland to stay with her Israelite mother-in-law Naomi. Ruth's devotion was so deep that her words still echo through generations. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. The children listen as Ruth gleans in the fields, gathering leftover grain to feed herself and Naomi, and as Boaz, a kind man, notices her labor and kindness. The elder's voice softens as she tells of Ruth's marriage to Boaz and the child born of their union, Obed, who would become the grandfather of King David. For the weary listeners, this is not just a tale of love and loyalty, but a reminder, even in times of loss and exile, redemption can come. Stories are not mere entertainment here. They are lifelines. They carry the weight of history and the hope of survival. They remind a people who have seen too much suffering that they are part of a greater story, one that began with Abraham beneath foreign stars, continued with Moses on a mountain shrouded in fire and smoke, and will one day culminate in a kingdom of peace and plenty. Even the children, though too young to understand all the words, feel the power in them. The rhythm of the story settles into their bones, teaching them courage, patience, and faith. Outside, the night deepens. The wind picks up slightly, whistling through cracks in the stone walls. From the hills, the lonely cry of an owl cuts through the silence. But within the homes, the people feel cocooned in their circle of light, their fears held at bay by the ancient cadence of memory. As Joab finishes his story, Miriam's eyes have drifted closed. Levi fights sleep, wanting desperately to hear the ending, but his head lolls against his father's chest. Sarah smiles faintly as she adjusts the blanket over their small bodies. Before the fire dies completely, Joab whispers a final psalm. He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The words settle into the stillness like a balm. They are not just ancient poetry, but a quiet declaration of faith that even in this brutal, uncertain world, someone watches over them. This is the long night in ancient Israel, a time of rest, of remembrance, of stories that bind generations together. Tomorrow will bring its trials, backbreaking labor, parched fields, rumors of raiders. But tonight, they are safe. Tonight, they are together. And tonight, the stories of their ancestors wrap around them like a warm cloak against the cold. As the embers glow faintly in the hearth and the stars wheel silently overhead, the village sleeps at last. The night holds its breath. And for a few precious hours, all is well. Here, under the pale wash of moonlight, the land seems almost soft, its jagged stones smoothed by shadows, its parched soil cloaked in a tender quiet. But those who live here know the truth. This is not a gentle place. This is a land that asks much of its people and gives little in return. It asks them to rise before the sun, their bodies heavy with fatigue, yet driven by necessity. It asks them to coax life from stubborn soil, to draw water from reluctant wells, to guard their families against enemies seen and unseen. It asks them to face the death of children with dry-eyed resolve, to bury loved ones in rocky graves, and return, almost without pause, to the endless work of survival. And yet, against all odds, they endure. Perhaps this is the greatest miracle of all. Not the parting of seas or the falling of manna, not the thundering voice of God from Sinai, but the quiet, uncelebrated persistence of ordinary people. They endure because they must, because to live even one more day is to honor the generations before them and the hope of generations to come. They endure because there is no other choice. As you listen now, far removed from their world of dust and stone, it may be difficult to comprehend the daily weight these people carried. We turn on taps and water flows clear and cold. We open cupboards and find food waiting. We flick a switch and banish the darkness. But for them, every drop of water was a gift. Every meal, a triumph. Every peaceful night, a blessing too rare to take for granted. Imagine for a moment walking in their footsteps. Your feet are bare and calloused, your hands stained with earth and sweat. Your children cling to your garments, their thin faces lifted toward you with eyes that know too much of hunger and too little of ease. You work because you must. You pray because you must. And when the sun sets, you sit by the dying fire and tell the old stories, not just to remember, but to remind yourself that survival is possible, that it has always been possible. In this, perhaps, lies the secret of their resilience. They believed that life, however harsh, was not meaningless. They believed each moment of joy, a child's laughter, a sudden rainfall, the birth of a lamb, was worth the cost of their suffering. They believed that their God watched over them, even in silence, even in apparent absence. They believed in tomorrow, though tomorrow was never promised. The people of ancient Israel lived close to the edge, yet within them burned a quiet strength. It was not loud or dramatic. It did not come with banners or fanfare. It was the strength of a mother grinding barley with weary arms, the strength of a father standing watch through a long, cold night, the strength of a child carrying a jar of water, her small hands steady despite their cracks and blisters. This was their inheritance. This was their gift to the future. As the stars wheel silently overhead, the village sleeps. Children, curled beside their parents, dream not of plenty or luxury, but of simple things. A full belly, a safe home, a day without fear. Their dreams are fragile, yet they are enough to sustain them. For now they rest, and in their rest there is hope. So too may you rest now. Let the weight of their world settle gently in your mind, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the miracle of your own. Breathe deeply, feeling the softness of your bed, the stillness of your room, the quiet beating of your own heart. Each breath, each heartbeat, is a testament to an unbroken chain of survival that stretches back through the centuries, through famine and flood, through war and peace, all the way to these small, dusty villages beneath a starlit sky. Tonight, as you close your eyes, may you carry with you the resilience of those who came before, their courage, their endurance, their unyielding faith that tomorrow would come. And when the morning sun touches your face, may you rise with a renewed gratitude for the fragile, miraculous gift of life. The people of ancient Israel remind us that we are all, in some way, survivors, carrying forward the light of those who lived and loved in a world as beautiful as it was brutal. Their story is not just history, it is humanity, and it lives on in you. The embers in their hearths have cooled now, leaving only a faint glow in the ashes. Outside, the first light of dawn brushes the horizon, and with it comes the sound of waking life, the lowing of animals, the rustle of straw, the soft murmur of a mother soothing her child. A new day begins. The struggle continues, and still the people endure. So too will you,